The mornings in our house always carried a certain kind of stillness, the sort that didn't comfort you but pressed quietly against your chest like the weight of expectation. I used to think of it as peace. Lately, it felt more like sedation. I stood by the kitchen counter, drying a glass that, judging by the fine layer of dust on the shelf, hadn't been touched in weeks. The marble beneath my fingertips was cold, polished to perfection. Like everything else here, pristine, untouched, deliberately arranged, yet somehow lifeless. A home curated more for admiration than for living. My husband liked it this way. Everything in its place, everyone performing their roles. Breakfast at 8, dinner at 7. A kiss on the cheek before he left for work. The same kiss on the forehead when he returned. Affectionate, habitual, careful. Never spontaneous, never hungry. When I spoke, he listened with his eyes but answered with rehearsed phrases. Nothing harsh, nothing unkind. Just practiced. Correct. I tried not to mind. For years, I told myself that stability was the highest form of love, that there was dignity in reliability. And perhaps there is. But there's also a quiet death in it. I adjusted the neckline of my blouse, feeling the soft brush of silk against my skin, a small indulgence I allowed myself most days, even when there was no one to notice. Not out of vanity, but out of something harder to explain. A need to remember that beneath the role of wife, hostess, and caretaker, there was still a woman who wanted to be seen. The kettle clicked off on its own, the steam curling upward like a soft sigh. I poured water into my cup, watching the swirl of the tea bag as it sank and bled its color into the clear water. A familiar, practiced motion. But that morning, the silence was broken. The front door opened with a soft creak, followed by the rustle of a jacket being shaken free of rain. I expected my husband, though it was earlier than usual for him to return. But then I heard the voice. Deeper, warmer, a tone that hadn't echoed through these halls for years. "Hey, anyone home?" I froze, the cup pausing midway to my lips. I hadn't seen him in almost 3 years. His son from his first marriage, always distant but polite, always somewhere else, living his own life. The last I heard, he'd moved across the country, chasing jobs and adventure. My husband spoke of him often, always with pride. I heard their greeting before I saw them. A warm, tight hug, familiar laughter filling the hallway. The sound of easy affection between a father and his grown son, and I stood in the kitchen, feeling like a spectator in my own home. When I finally turned toward the doorway, towel still in hand, he was already there. Older, broader. Shoulders squared with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent enough time away to shape his own gravity. There was stubble along his jaw now, darker than I remembered, and eyes that held something softer than I expected. Less defiance. More observation. "Good to see you again," he said, stepping forward. I managed to smile, folded the towel neatly over the back of the chair. "You too." He moved toward me without hesitation and hugged me. Warm, firm, longer than I was prepared for. I stiffened slightly, unsure where to place my hands, then rested them lightly against his back. When he pulled away, his smile stayed. "You haven't changed at all," he added, but his eyes said otherwise. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "Oh, I doubt that." The conversation drifted back to my husband, his plans for the day, his enthusiasm about having his son back in town. I listened, nodding at the right moments, asking polite questions. But I couldn't help noticing the way the younger man looked at me. The way his gaze didn't slide off politely as most men's did, but settled, held, like he was really seeing me. It wasn't bold. It wasn't inappropriate. But it was there, a weight beneath the surface of the words. They sat together in the living room while I cleaned the kitchen, their voices rising and falling like the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. Occasionally, I caught fragments of their conversation. Plans to catch up, talk about work, maybe a dinner together. I tried to focus on the dishes, on the sound of the water, on the clink of glass against porcelain. But when I glanced toward the doorway again, I found him watching me from across the room. Not staring, not gawking, watching. And I felt my pulse respond before I could tell it not to. That night, after my husband had gone to bed early, as he often did after a long day, I found myself lingering by the window in the upstairs hallway. Below, in the soft glow of the garden lights, the young man stood alone outside, smoking a cigarette, one hand in his pocket, the other lifting the glowing ember to his lips. His eyes tilted upward, and for a moment I thought he might have sensed me there. I stepped back into the shadow of the wall, heart pounding harder than it should have. I told myself it was nothing. That I was foolish, imagining things. That it was only the awkwardness of reunion, the polite warmth of family ties. But somewhere, beneath the practiced calm, something had shifted. And I felt it. Quiet, slow, undeniable. I slept badly that night, replaying every glance, every smile, over and over again. Wondering whether he had really looked at me the way I thought he did, or whether I had simply wanted him to. The next morning, I was up earlier than usual. Sleep had been thin and restless, my mind too occupied with thoughts I wasn't proud of. The house felt too quiet for the number of people inside it. I moved through the rooms in soft slippers, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that still clung to the air. In the kitchen, the window above the sink let in the soft gray light of a cloudy morning. I poured myself coffee, black, no sugar, the way I always did when I needed to stay sharp. My husband was still asleep upstairs, and the house, for that brief moment, belonged only to me. Or so I thought. The sound of the back door creaking open startled me. I turned to see him stepping inside, damp from the morning air, hair tousled, jacket casually slung over one shoulder. He smiled when he saw me, easy and familiar, like he belonged here. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. I nodded, unsure how to answer without sounding awkward. "You're up early." He shrugged, moving toward the coffee machine without asking. Comfortable, as though he'd always known his way around this kitchen. "Jet lag, probably." Figured I'd take a walk. I watched as he poured himself a cup, leaning against the counter across from me. He didn't rush to fill the silence, and that somehow made it worse. There was no need for small talk between us, but the weight of the unspoken made my skin feel too tight. "You always this put together first thing in the morning?" His eyes ran the length of my body, lingering a beat too long on the thin knit of my sweater that clung a little closer than I intended. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but kept my expression neutral. "Habit," I replied, folding my arms across my stomach. He smiled again, but it was softer this time. "I guess some habits are worth keeping." We didn't say more after that. He stepped out into the garden, coffee in hand, leaving me standing there with the uncomfortable buzz of my own pulse in my ears. The rest of the morning blurred into routine. My husband joined us at the table, cheerful, unaware. He talked about work, about meetings and clients, about things that filled space but never quite touched the ground between us. I nodded at all the right places, asked the expected questions, smiled when appropriate. But my mind kept circling back, unwilling, to the look in the younger man's eyes. By afternoon, my husband suggested they work on clearing the shed in the back garden, an old project left unfinished from the last summer. I offered to help because refusing would have seemed strange. The three of us spent hours sorting through boxes and tools, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and earth. At one point, while my husband wrestled with a stack of old planks, I felt the brush of a hand against my waist. Light. Barely there, but deliberate. I didn't turn my head right away, afraid my face would betray more than I could explain. Instead, I focused on the task in front of me, pretending not to notice. Later, when my husband went inside to take a call, I stayed back to tidy the tools, crouched near the garden wall. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, unhurried. I felt his presence before he spoke. "You should let me do that," he said, his voice low. I looked over my shoulder, ready to insist I was fine, but he was already crouching beside me, his hand brushing mine as he reached for the same hammer. I froze for half a second. Long enough. Neither of us moved away. His fingers stayed on mine, firm but not forceful. He didn't let go, and I didn't pull away. "You're shaking," he said softly, eyes steady on me. I opened my mouth, ready to deny it, but the words caught somewhere between my throat and my pride. Instead, I stared at him, caught in the impossible closeness of the moment, too aware of how dangerous it was. And then he leaned closer, so close I could feel the warmth of his breath against my cheek. His hand moved slowly, lifting to touch the side of my face, his thumb tracing just below my jaw. He watched me, waited, giving me the chance to stop this. I didn't. I should have. But I didn't. The first press of his lips against mine was slow, cautious, as though testing the ground before stepping forward. But when I didn't move away, when my hands stayed where they were, fingers clenched uselessly around the handle of the hammer, the kiss deepened. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was deliberate, controlled. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission because it knows the answer already. I felt my body respond before my mind could catch up. The soft yielding of my lips, the tilt of my head to meet him halfway. There was no part of me that wanted to stop him. No part of me that pulled away. When the kiss finally broke, he didn't step back. His forehead rested against mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "You shouldn't have done that," I whispered, though my voice betrayed no real conviction. His eyes didn't flinch. "You didn't stop me." I stood too quickly, brushing dirt from my knees, avoiding his gaze. My hands trembled as I gathered the last of the tools, forcing myself into motion, trying to steady the chaos beneath my ribs. Behind me, I felt his eyes follow every step I took. When I stepped into the house again, my husband was still on the phone, pacing back and forth in the hallway, too consumed by whatever business conversation he was tangled in to notice the flush in my cheeks or the shake in my breath. I busied myself with washing my hands at the sink, scrubbing harder than necessary, trying to erase the feeling of his lips, his hand on my skin. But some things don't wash off that easily. That night, I lay awake long after my husband's soft snoring had filled the room, staring at the ceiling, tasting the memory of that kiss like a secret I couldn't spit out. And somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the guilt and the shame, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be the last time. The days that followed folded themselves neatly into the usual patterns of our life. Schedules, dinners, polite exchanges over coffee. On the surface, nothing had changed. The routine held strong, like wallpaper over a crack in the wall. But the crack was there, widening with each glance that lingered too long, every silence that stretched just a little past comfortable. I told myself I wouldn't be alone with him again. I told myself the kiss was a mistake, a momentary lapse, nothing more. I told myself this so many times it began to sound like prayer. But prayers, I've learned, are only words when your body is already speaking another language. He didn't avoid me. On the contrary, he remained present, perfectly at ease, weaving himself into the small spaces of the day as if nothing had happened at all. And maybe that should have made it easier for me to do the same, to retreat into the safe rhythm of denial. But it didn't. I caught myself watching him more than I meant to, noticing the curve of his smile when he joked with his father, the easy confidence in the way he moved through the house, making himself at home. Noticed the way he looked at me when he thought no one else was watching. The weight of that gaze was enough to make my breath catch in my throat, enough to send my pulse racing beneath my skin. It was during one of these ordinary days that my husband announced his plan for the evening. A dinner with colleagues, one of those necessary social rituals that I'd long since stopped attending. I smiled, nodded, wished him a good evening. He kissed my cheek, soft, distant, the way he always did. A gesture that was more habit than hunger. After he left, the house felt too large, too quiet. I busied myself with small things, folding laundry, wiping down counters that were already clean. Anything to keep my hands moving, to keep my thoughts from drifting where they wanted to go. I didn't hear him come downstairs. But when I turned from the sink, there he was, leaning against the doorway, watching me with that same unreadable expression. Home alone tonight? His voice was casual, but there was something beneath it, something deliberate. I nodded, forcing my attention back to the dish towel in my hands. Your father has a work dinner. He stepped into the kitchen, slow, measured. You don't usually go with him. I kept my eyes on the towel. No. The silence between us thickened, stretched. I could feel him watching me, feel the tension crackling in the space where words failed to bridge the distance. You know, he said finally, his tone softer now. I've been trying to tell myself that what happened the other day didn't mean anything. My hands froze mid-motion. But I can't. I turned then, slowly, deliberately meeting his gaze. You shouldn't say things like that. But it's true. His eyes held steady, unwavering. And I don't think I'm the only one who feels that way. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had closed too tightly around the words. He stepped closer, and I found myself standing still, unable, unwilling to move. You could have stopped me, he said quietly. But you didn't. The honesty of it hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to deny it, to argue, but there was no ground beneath my feet to stand on. And we both knew it. I tried to put space between us, stepping back toward the counter, but he followed, slow, unrelenting. His hand reached out, gentle, fingers brushing the side of my wrist where my pulse betrayed me. I've been thinking about you, he murmured, his voice barely more than breath. Every day since. I closed my eyes, trying to summon anger, indignation, anything that would anchor me back to reason. But all I felt was heat. We can't, I whispered, my voice shaking. This can't happen. But my hands didn't push him away. Instead, they found the edge of the counter behind me, gripping hard as if that would keep me grounded. He moved in closer, his body so near I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the tension humming between us like an electric current. Then came the sound of keys at the front door. The sharp jolt of reality snapped through the air like a whip. I stepped back so fast I nearly stumbled, my heart slamming against my ribs. He didn't move, only watched me, eyes steady, lips pressing into a thin line as if holding back the words he wanted to say. My husband's voice called from the hallway, cheerful, oblivious. Forgot my phone. I turned toward the sink, gripping the edge hard enough that my knuckles turned white, forcing my breath to steady. By the time my husband stepped into the kitchen, smiling, asking if I'd seen his phone, my face was calm again, my voice even. I pointed to the side table where the phone rested, right where he'd left it. Found it, he said, lifting it with a grin. I'll be home late. Another kiss on the cheek, another routine gesture. The door closed behind him, and the house fell silent once more. But the silence between us now was different. It pulsed with everything we hadn't said, everything we both knew was waiting beneath the surface. Later that night, I stood at the window again, staring out into the garden where the faint glow of the porch light cut through the dark. I half expected to see him there, leaning against the railing, cigarette glowing at his fingertips. Instead, I found my own reflection in the glass. A woman who no longer recognized the shape of her own desires. Somewhere beneath the guilt and the fear, I knew this wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. It's strange how quickly the body betrays the mind. How even when you convince yourself you won't look for someone, your eyes find them anyway. As if your skin remembers what your conscience works so hard to forget. The following days moved slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. Conversations over breakfast turned into background noise. My husband's words drifted past me like distant traffic. I nodded, smiled, answered where I was expected to, But inside, my thoughts circled like vultures, returning again and again to the moment I should have ended. I started avoiding the garden altogether. I kept myself locked in the small office upstairs under the pretense of sorting old paperwork. Kept the door half closed so I could pretend not to hear the sound of footsteps moving through the hallways downstairs. I told myself if I kept enough space between us, the weight of it would eventually dissolve. I would forget how it felt when his hand touched my wrist, when his lips hovered so close to mine that I could taste the air between us. But he didn't play along. He was patient, persistent in small, quiet ways, never reckless, never bold enough to force anything. But he was there, in the corners of my days, in the spaces my husband never noticed. A soft presence, a shadow that lingered even after he'd walked away. It was my husband who gave him the next opportunity, without knowing it. Sunday morning, over the last sip of his coffee, he mentioned the shed again. How much work was still left to do, how the weather would hold this week, and maybe it was the perfect time to finish clearing it out. I could have argued, could have said it was fine the way it was, that we could hire someone. But I didn't. "I'll help," his son offered before I could speak. I felt the words settle in the air like the slow drop of a stone into deep water. My throat tightened. My husband smiled, oblivious. "That would be great. I'll be in meetings most of the week, but if you two could knock it out, that would save me the trouble." There was no malice in his suggestion, no suspicion, only the ease of a man who trusted too well. The next afternoon, while my husband buried himself in conference calls upstairs, I found myself standing at the back of the garden again, hands tucked deep into the pockets of my jacket, watching the younger man pull open the creaking door of the shed. Dust rose up around him in the sunlight, catching in the air like smoke. I told myself I was only there to supervise, only there to be helpful. The first hour passed in relative silence. We worked side by side, sorting through old boxes, stacking forgotten tools into neat piles. Every so often, our hands brushed accidentally, but I felt each one like a spark against my skin. I tried to focus on the task, on the rhythm of lifting, sorting, stacking, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of his presence so close to mine. The smell of his skin warmed by the sun, the occasional glance that burned hotter than the afternoon air. It was when we reached the back wall of the shed that the pretense finally cracked. We stood too close in the narrow space between the shelves and the wall, both of us reaching for the same box at once. His hand brushed mine, and neither of us moved away. I kept my eyes on the box, on the shape of his fingers, on the veins beneath the skin of his hand. Anything to avoid looking at his face. But I felt him watching me. "You keep trying to pretend this isn't happening," he said quietly, voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the cardboard edge of the box. Because it shouldn't be. But it is. I heard him step closer, felt the heat of him at my back. His hand hovered near my waist, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the gravity of it pulling at me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he murmured, each word slow, deliberate. "And I know you feel the same." I turned then, too sharply, the box nearly slipping from my hands, but he caught it, steadying it between us, fingers grazing mine. The look in his eyes was steady, patient, but beneath it was hunger, controlled, waiting. I wanted to say something, to deny it, to put an end to this before the line between us blurred any further. But my lips refused to move, my body rooted in place by the weight of my own betrayal. In the distance, I could hear my husband's voice carrying faintly from the open upstairs window, a reminder of everything I was supposed to be, of the life I was supposed to protect. I stepped back, breaking the moment, forcing air between us again. "This can't happen," I said, forcing each word out as though they weighed more than my own breath. "It can't." He didn't argue. He didn't step closer, but he didn't look away. "Tell me you don't want it," he said. I opened my mouth, closed it again. I couldn't say the words. The tension between us was so thick it felt like the air itself might snap. But instead of pushing further, he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned back toward the pile of boxes. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. We worked the rest of the afternoon in silence. But the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, heavy with everything we hadn't said. That night, as I stood brushing my hair before bed, my husband came up behind me, kissed the top of my shoulder, told me how grateful he was that we were getting so much done around the house. His hands slid around my waist, familiar, predictable. The touch of a man who believed he still knew me. I let him hold me. I let him kiss me goodnight. But my body felt like it wasn't mine, and my thoughts were already somewhere else. The following days moved with a strange heaviness, as if the air itself resisted every step I took. I tried to bury myself in the comfort of routine, preparing dinner, answering emails, folding clothes into neat piles that no one but me seemed to care about. But no amount of folded linen could quiet the relentless ache in my chest. My husband remained his usual self. Thoughtful, considerate, always asking about my day, always believing the answers I gave him. Answers that had begun to taste like paper in my mouth. The shed stood at the edge of the garden like a witness, holding between its four walls the echo of words that should never have been spoken. I avoided it as best I could. Avoided him. Or at least tried. But avoidance is a coward's strategy when desire has already taken root. It was the following weekend when the next fracture appeared, thin and dangerous, widening the crack that already ran beneath the surface of our house. My husband, cheerful as ever, announced he would be leaving for 2 nights. A short business trip. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. He kissed my forehead, told me not to tire myself with housework, promised to call before bed. I stood there, nodded, smiled, played my part. The moment the door closed behind him, the silence settled like a second skin. I told myself I would stay busy. I told myself I would use the time alone to reset, to clear my mind, to find again the balance that had slipped so dangerously from my grasp. I told myself all the things a good wife should say when the house grows too quiet. But hours passed, and the silence only grew louder. By evening, I sat curled on the living room sofa, a book open on my lap, unread. The television played softly in the background, but I couldn't have said what show was on. My mind, traitorous, wandered where I'd forbidden it to go. It was nearly dark when I heard the soft knock at the back door. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I told myself not to answer, told myself to sit still, let it pass. But my body moved before my mind could argue. I crossed the kitchen, hand already on the handle, heart pounding hard enough that I thought he might hear it through the door. When I opened it, he stood there, one hand tucked into the pocket of his jacket, the other holding a small brown paper bag. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, lifting the bag slightly. I didn't answer. I should have closed the door. I should have sent him away. But I didn't. I stepped back instead, silent permission, and he entered the kitchen as though he'd always belonged there. He unpacked the bag with quiet efficiency. 2 containers of takeout from the small Italian place at the corner, the one my husband always dismissed as too heavy for dinner. "I figured you might appreciate something other than salad and steamed fish," he said, a hint of humor softening the edges of his words. I tried to protest, out of obligation more than conviction. But the smell of warm bread and tomato sauce filled the kitchen, and I realized how little I'd eaten that day. We ate at the counter side by side, the conversation light at first. Safe topics, surface-level chatter. But it didn't stay there for long. "I've been trying to keep my distance," he said after a while, his fork pushing the last bite of pasta across the plate. "I thought maybe if I gave you space, it would go away." I set down my glass of wine, the stem trembling faintly between my fingers. "But it hasn't," he added. I felt my body tense, my throat tighten. "You shouldn't be here." His gaze didn't falter. "Then tell me to leave." I opened my mouth, closed it again. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. My skin buzzed beneath my blouse, every nerve alive, every instinct at war with itself. He reached for my hand where it rested on the countertop, his fingers brushing lightly over my knuckles. The touch was soft, but the heat of it burned through me. "I can't stop wanting you," he said, barely above a whisper. "I know I should, but I can't." My breath caught somewhere between anger and longing. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to run, but I didn't move. Instead, I felt my fingers turn, slow and deliberate, pressing into the warmth of his hand as if my body had made its choice long before my mind could catch up. The space between us disappeared before I realized I'd leaned into it. His lips found mine again, slower this time, deeper, with the aching tenderness of someone who knew the risk and wanted it anyway. There was no hesitation in me now, no protest. Only the dangerous, quiet surrender to everything I had tried so hard to deny. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the hard line of his body against mine. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. When we finally broke apart, the room spun faintly around me. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself, heart racing so fast I thought it might tear from my chest. I could feel his breath on my cheek, the soft weight of his hand still resting against my hip. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. We both knew the line had been crossed again. Not by accident, not by weakness, but by choice. And the worst part was how right it felt. I hardly slept that night. The sheets felt wrong against my skin, too heavy, too warm, as though they knew what I had done. The ceiling above our bed stretched endless and blank, offering no comfort, no forgiveness. My husband's side of the bed remained untouched, pillows stacked neatly where his head should have been. The room was too quiet without the soft rhythm of his breathing. I used to find peace in that sound, the familiar presence of someone steady, reliable. But now, the absence pressed harder than his presence ever did. I lay still for hours, replaying the night again and again, each memory vivid and undeniable. The heat of his hands, the weight of his lips against mine, the way my body answered him before my conscience could intervene. I told myself that guilt should feel heavier than this. I waited for the crushing wave of regret, the recoil, the shame that was supposed to follow. But it didn't come, not the way I expected. What came instead was hunger. The terrible, selfish hunger for more. By morning, my body felt brittle from the weight of what I was holding inside. I moved through the motions of the day like a ghost, making coffee, feeding the neighbor's cat who always wandered into our garden, watering the plants on the windowsill that never seemed to thrive no matter how much care I gave them. I could feel the difference in my breath, in the way my hands shook just a little when I touched the porcelain of the coffee cup. Every ordinary act now hummed beneath the surface with the memory of him. When my husband called from his hotel, his voice was cheerful as always, soft with the ease of someone who never had reason to doubt. He asked about the house, about my plans for the day, whether I'd managed to relax. I answered each question calmly, evenly, like a woman with nothing to hide. I wondered if he could hear the lie in my voice, but I knew he couldn't. He trusted me too much. That had always been the problem. The second night alone was worse. The house felt like it was listening. The creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor's television through the thin evening air, all of it seemed sharper, louder, as if the world itself was leaning in to catch me slipping. I avoided the kitchen where we had stood so close, where his hands had known exactly where to find me. But no room felt safe from the weight of what had happened. The garden outside the window, the hallway, the space at the foot of the stairs. Every corner held his shadow now. I told myself I wouldn't answer if he came again. I told myself I would draw the line. Finally. Firmly. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't. The truth of it sat thick in my chest. Undeniable. When the knock came, soft against the back door just after sundown, I was already standing near the window, waiting. I paused, hand hovering over the doorknob longer than I should have. But the door opened anyway. He stepped inside quietly, his expression unreadable, the calm control in his eyes belying the tension I could feel radiating off him. He didn't speak at first. Neither did I. The space between us felt charged, dangerous, the kind of silence that waits for someone to admit the thing neither of you wants to say out loud. "I shouldn't be here," he said, voice low, almost gentle. I nodded because that was true. He shouldn't have been here. But I didn't ask him to leave. "You should tell me to go," he added. I couldn't. My throat refused to shape the words. My body stood still, but my chest felt like it might crack open beneath the weight of wanting. His eyes searched my face, waiting, giving me the chance to stop this. One last opportunity to choose the safer path. I didn't take it. Instead, I let the air between us collapse, stepped forward before I could change my mind, before fear could build its wall again. The kiss this time came without hesitation. No soft testing of boundaries, no slow build. It was hungry, desperate, the clash of need that had been kept at bay too long. His hands gripped my hips, pulling me closer, and I answered him without thought, without restraint. I felt the hard line of his body against mine, the press of his mouth demanding more than I should ever have given. My fingers found the edge of his jacket, clinging as though it might steady the shaking inside me. When we broke apart, breathless, our foreheads resting together, I felt the tremble in my knees. I gripped the edge of the counter behind me, holding on like a drowning woman to driftwood. "I can't stop," he said into the space between us. "Even if you asked me to." I closed my eyes. I should have told him to stop. Should have told him that this couldn't go any further. But my hands didn't let go. We stayed there like that for a long moment, suspended between right and wrong, the lines between them dissolving faster than either of us could rebuild. When he finally stepped back, his hand lingered at my waist, fingers pressing softly against the curve of my side as though memorizing the shape of me. "I'll leave before he comes back," he said, quieter now. "But this isn't over." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because somewhere inside, beneath the fear and the guilt, I knew he was right. The morning my husband returned, the house fell back into its careful rhythm as though nothing had shifted beneath its walls. He kissed me at the door, warm and familiar. The same kiss he had given me for years. Gentle, practiced, the kind of touch that asked nothing and expected even less. I let him hold me, smiled the way I was supposed to, and helped carry his suitcase upstairs, my hands steady while my mind spiraled. There was no trace of last night left in the air. No scent, no sign. Only the echo of his son's hands on my skin, the memory of lips that had marked me far more deeply than I wanted to admit. I thought I could keep these worlds separate, that I could tuck the wrongness into a neat box inside me and close the lid. But the box wouldn't stay closed. The lid kept rattling. I moved through the day like an actress on a well-rehearsed stage. The table was set for 3 again, plates arranged perfectly, silverware aligned like soldiers waiting for orders. My husband spoke freely about his trip, about the dull meetings in the quiet hotel, while I nodded, inserted small questions at the right intervals, smiled where I should. I was perfect. Almost. But the longer the evening stretched, the more I felt his eyes on me. Not my husband's, but his son's, seated just across the table, playing the same game of polite distance, though I could feel the heat of his gaze in the spaces where no one was supposed to be looking. It wasn't bold, not reckless. His movements were easy, relaxed, perfectly appropriate. But beneath the ease was that same quiet insistence, the knowing weight of what we now shared. Every glance between us hummed with the danger of the thing we weren't saying out loud. Later that night, after the dishes had been cleared, after my husband had excused himself early to catch up on work calls, I stayed behind in the kitchen longer than necessary, wiping down counters that were already clean. I could feel him before I heard him. The slow approach of footsteps that stopped just shy of the threshold. Neither of us spoke. I kept my back to him, The rag clenched too tightly in my hands, but my breath betrayed me. Shallow, quick, as though my body had already stepped into the space my mind still tried to deny. The sound of his voice, low and measured, broke the silence. "Does he ever really see you?" I closed my eyes, forcing the breath out of my chest slowly, willing my hands to steady. But the question lodged itself beneath my skin, pulsing there, too close to the truth. I didn't turn. I didn't answer. "I do," he added, quieter now. The words sat between us, heavy as stone. I heard the soft retreat of his footsteps, felt the weight of him leaving the room, but the imprint of what he'd said remained. It followed me up the stairs into the bedroom where my husband worked late into the night, his voice steady and professional on the phone, his eyes flickering occasionally toward me with that same polite affection. He didn't notice the way my hands trembled slightly as I folded my nightclothes. He didn't notice the heat that still clung to my skin from words that hadn't come from his mouth. The next morning was bright. Too bright. The sky outside washed clean from the rain that had come through during the night. My husband suggested we host a dinner later in the week, something small, just a few friends and neighbors, a celebration of sorts to welcome his son home properly. He was enthusiastic, smiling, already making lists in his head. I nodded, agreed easily, played my part. But the plan sent a cold ripple through my spine. It meant more time together, more eyes watching, more risk. And yet, beneath the fear, I felt the quick surge of anticipation rising again, the sick, addictive rush of wanting what I shouldn't, the thrill of standing at the edge of the cliff, knowing the drop was waiting. The day of the dinner came too fast. The house filled with laughter, the soft clink of glasses, the polished sheen of everything in its right place. My dress was chosen carefully, understated but elegant, the neckline just a little lower than necessary, the fabric skimming the curve of my hips in a way I knew he would notice. And he did. Throughout the evening, I caught the flicker of his gaze, the small, almost imperceptible tilt of his head when his eyes followed the line of my bare shoulders. No words passed between us, but the current hummed louder than the music playing softly in the background. At one point, while my husband was deep in conversation with a neighbor about something inconsequential, I felt the brush of fingers graze my lower back as he passed behind me. No one else the wiser. The touch so fleeting it could have been an accident. But we both knew it wasn't. The touch left my skin burning. My breath caught again in that familiar, shameful place between guilt and longing. When the guests began to thin out, coats gathered, goodbyes exchanged at the door, I stood in the hallway, my hands clenched behind my back to keep them from shaking. His eyes found me one last time across the room, a look that lasted only a second longer than it should have. A silent reminder. This wasn't over, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to be. The following week settled over the house like a film of dust, soft and heavy, coating everything it touched. Nothing visible had changed, but beneath the surface, the weight of what we carried began to press harder, pulling the air taut between us. My husband moved through his days as always. Steady, dependable, never questioning the routines we had built together. There was comfort in the predictability of him, and yet that very predictability had become the stage where my betrayal played out, unnoticed. I avoided the younger man as best I could, or perhaps I only pretended to avoid him. The truth was, no matter how carefully I moved, I was always aware of where he was in the house, of the spaces where our paths might cross. My body knew his presence before my eyes ever confirmed it. A shift in the air, a shadow where there hadn't been one a moment before. It was as though my senses had been rewired entirely around him. But the tension between us had begun to shift. No longer the silent, smoldering kind that waits patiently in the corners. Now it moved, restless, testing the edges of control, daring one of us to break the thin barrier of restraint we still tried to maintain. The breaking point came, as it often does, through something small. A forgotten jacket left on the back porch after a rainstorm, the sleeves damp, the fabric cool against my fingers as I lifted it from the railing. I carried it inside, unsure whether to leave it in the hallway or bring it upstairs. My hand hovered over the banister. the decision too trivial to take so long. But he appeared at the top of the staircase before I could choose, leaning casually against the frame, eyes catching mine in that same steady way he always did, like he was waiting to see how long I could pretend this wasn't happening. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, soft, the words curving in the quiet space between us. I nodded, setting the jacket down on the banister instead of bringing it up. I turned to go, but he was already moving, already coming down the stairs, each step measured, deliberate. He stopped just in front of me, too close for anything casual. "You're afraid to be alone with me now," he said, not asking, but observing. I tried to push past him, but he blocked the narrow passage easily, leaning one hand against the wall beside me, his body angled so that I could feel the heat radiating from him. "I should be," I answered, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "But you're not," he replied. His words pressed too hard against the truth I didn't want to face. I felt my back against the wall, the smooth coolness of the paint grounding me as I tried to steady my breath. His eyes didn't leave mine, watching me with that same unbearable patience. "You want this as much as I do." I could have denied it. I could have argued, turned my head, stepped away. But I didn't, because it was true. And the truth had become harder to swallow than the lie. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between our bodies was thin as breath, the tension pulling at my resolve like threads unraveling one by one. I could feel the heat of him, the familiar ache beneath my ribs that came whenever he stood too close. He leaned in, slow, giving me time to turn away. Time to tell him no. But I didn't. The kiss came hard this time, the quiet ache of restraint replaced by something rougher, hungrier. His hands caught my waist, fingers pressing into the fabric of my dress as though he could pull me closer through it. I felt my own hands find his shoulders, gripping tighter than I meant to, holding on because I couldn't make myself let go. The weight of him against me, the warmth of his mouth, the soft gasp that escaped me before I could stop it. All of it filled the hallway with something too loud to call silence. When he finally pulled back, his breathing was uneven, his forehead resting lightly against mine. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered. But my hands still held onto the sleeves of his shirt, knuckles white. "I know," he answered, but the words sounded hollow between us. We stood like that, frozen in the moment, neither of us willing to step away, until the sound of my husband's voice floated up from the living room below, calling my name. I startled, pulled away as if burned. My hands dropped from his shoulders and I turned too quickly, my head ducked down as though I could hide the flush on my face. The younger man didn't follow. He stayed where he was, standing halfway down the stairs watching me go. I composed myself as best I could before stepping into the living room, answering my husband's question about dinner plans with a voice steadier than my hands. He smiled, kissed my cheek lightly, and returned to his newspaper, unaware. I stood there for a moment longer, watching him, feeling the sharp twist of guilt curl tighter in my chest. But beneath the guilt, the hunger was still there. Worse now, because I had tasted again what I told myself I didn't want. And I knew neither of us was going to stop. I told myself that I had control, that whatever had happened between us could still be undone if only I stayed away long enough, if only I held my breath and let the fire starve itself of oxygen. But desire has never been something that dies quietly. It waits. It studies your patterns. It knows the places where your armor is thin. The days turned colder as autumn crept in around the edges of the house. Mornings began with that familiar bite of air sneaking through the window cracks, the smell of damp leaves carried in on the wind. I could have blamed the chill for the way my skin felt electric under my clothes, the way my hands shook just slightly when I reached for the kettle. But I knew better. The tremble inside me had nothing to do with the weather. My husband moved through his routine unchanged, still wrapped in the certainty that comes from a life where nothing seems to threaten the walls you've built. He kissed my forehead each night before bed, the same tender press of lips, a ritual of care so gentle it almost felt like cruelty. How easy it was to hold someone with so much affection and never once notice how far away they'd drifted. It was a Thursday when he mentioned the idea of a weekend away. "Just the two of us," he said, smiling over the rim of his coffee cup. A short escape to the coast. Familiar hotel. Familiar view. The kind of place we'd gone to in the earlier years when we still believed those little gestures were enough to fix the things we didn't say out loud. He spoke of quiet dinners, of walking the shoreline, of time alone together, and I listened with a smile I had practiced too well. I agreed, of course. There was no reason not to. The arrangements were simple. 2 nights, a bag packed with the soft sweaters he liked me to wear, the comfortable jeans that made me feel less like a woman and more like a wife. I folded the clothes neatly, my hands steady, but my chest felt hollow. He left early the next morning to finalize a few things at work, leaving me at home to prepare. I stood at the window as his car pulled out of the driveway, watching the taillights disappear down the street. And there, in the quiet that followed, I felt the weight of my own betrayal settle deeper into my bones. I had every intention of spending the morning alone. I told myself I needed the space to clear my head, to remember who I was before the edges of my life had started to blur. But before noon, I heard the soft knock at the back door. I didn't move to answer it right away. I stood in the hallway, watching the handle from across the room, knowing exactly who stood on the other side. The minutes stretched too long. The knock came again, gentler this time, patient. When I finally opened the door, his eyes met mine without hesitation. No smile, no easy charm this time. Just the steady, dangerous pull of everything we had tried and failed to bury. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped back, letting him inside. The words that followed were quieter than I expected. No anger, no accusations. Just the raw, unvarnished truth of two people who could no longer pretend they hadn't crossed a line they wanted desperately to cross again. "I can't stay here and watch you pretend," he said. "I can't sit at the same table, listen to the two of you talk about dinner parties and weekend plans, and act like I don't want you." I stayed silent, because what could I possibly say? The words I should have spoken dissolved on my tongue, leaving only the pounding of my heart loud in my ears. "I don't want to hurt him," he continued, softer now, "but I can't be near you and act like this is nothing." I reached for the back of the chair nearest to me, gripping it hard to steady the shaking in my hands. "This was never supposed to happen," I managed, my voice thin. "But it did," he answered. "And we can keep pretending it didn't, but I'm not sure either of us can live like that." The air between us felt too thick to breathe. The kitchen, the same room where I had spent so many years moving through the quiet rhythms of a life I'd chosen, now felt smaller, suffocating. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw in his face the same fear I felt in my own chest, the terror of wanting something that could only end badly. I wanted to hate him for it, wanted to blame him for the way he had unraveled me, for the way he had made me see myself again after so many years of forgetting. But the truth was simpler, crueler. I had let him in. I had wanted him here. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of us at once. The pull between us too strong to resist any longer. His hands found my face, my waist, my back, pulling me against him with a desperation that felt more like confession than seduction. My mouth met his, and this time there was no softness, no hesitation, only hunger. I felt the hard press of his body against mine, the grip of his hands as though he was afraid I might vanish if he let go. My own hands moved without permission, tangled in the fabric of his shirt, holding on like it was the only thing keeping me upright. When we finally broke apart, breathless, the taste of him still on my lips, I felt the heat rise in my chest, the familiar flood of guilt rushing in too late to stop what had already been done. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered again, the same useless words I had said before. "I know," he answered, but his hands didn't leave my waist. We stood like that, locked in the ruin we had made together, knowing there was no easy way back from where we were. knowing too that neither of us wanted to take the first step away. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves across the garden path, the world moving on, oblivious to the quiet disaster unfolding inside these walls. And somewhere beneath the weight of everything I should have felt, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the place where we stopped pretending.